I've spent most of my life studying recessions, how they form, why they surprise us, and why the warnings always seem obvious only in hindsight. But as I look at the world today, heading toward 2026, I can't escape one conclusion. This next downturn will not look like 2008. It can't. The conditions are completely different. Most people think recessions are like movie sequels. They expect the same villains, the same plot, the same catastrophic collapse. After 2008, we've all been trained to see every financial danger through the lens of the housing crisis. Subprime mortgages, Wall Street greed, too big to fail banks. But the truth is more unsettling. The next crisis won't come from the same direction. It won't even rhyme with 2008, because this time, the vulnerabilities are not in the private financial sector. They're in the public sector, not in households taking on risky debt, but in governments drowning in obligations they can no longer finance cheaply. Not in banks failing, but in corporations forced to refinance trillions of dollars at interest rates. Their business models were never built to survive. When you understand this shift, something becomes clear. The 2026 recession will be unlike anything in our modern memory. I say that not as a forecaster, but as a historian. Every so often, the global economy goes through a structural shift so deep that the old playbook becomes worthless, and the early 2020s were exactly that kind of shift. I remember the aftermath of 2008 vividly. It reshaped everything: the rules of global finance, the psychology of investors, even how we talk about the economy. For years, any housing bubble or market panic was immediately labeled another 2008. But the 2008 crisis was extremely specific. It came from a rare alignment of conditions that are simply not present today. Back then, households were drowning in unaffordable mortgages, and banks were overloaded with toxic securities. The entire system was supported by cheap credit that masked enormous risk. But after 2008, the world went through a radical transformation. The center of risk quietly moved away from households and private banks and toward governments and corporations. Governments borrowed more than ever. Corporations borrowed more than ever. Central banks held interest rates near zero for almost a decade, and everyone just assumed it would last forever. Then, seemingly overnight, inflation returned, and the entire architecture of the post-2008 world began to wobble. The seeds of the next recession weren't planted by reckless homeowners or corrupt bankers. They were planted by policy, by stimulus, and by the false belief that interest rates could stay low forever. When you look at 2008 and 2026 side by side, one thing stands out more than anything else: the debt landscape has completely inverted. In 2008, the most dangerous debt was private subprime mortgages and over-leveraged households. But from 2010 onward, especially after the pandemic, the global economy was rebuilt on public debt. The United States expanded its government debt to levels we usually only see in wartime. Europe financed enormous social and energy relief packages. China accumulated provincial-level debt so large it's hard to even measure accurately. In 2008, governments were the rescuers. They provided liquidity, stimulus, and guarantees. But in 2026, governments might be the ones who need rescuing. And that is what makes this coming recession fundamentally different. Sovereign debt crises don't behave like banking crises. They unwind slower, they spread wider, and they affect everything from currency stability to geopolitical alliances. When a government carries too much debt, it faces a terrible choice: raise taxes and hurt economic growth, cut spending and hurt social stability, borrow more and risk a credibility crisis, or print money and ignite inflation. The pandemic forced governments to do all of these things at once, and the consequences are now coming due. But the real detonator for 2026 might not be governments alone, because while public debt soared, something dangerous happened in the background. Corporate debt entered a silent, fragile, and deeply unsustainable phase. From 2008 to 2021, corporations borrowed money at the cheapest rates in human history. Money was nearly free. So, they refinanced everything at ultra-low rates. That was fine until inflation returned, and central banks raised rates at the fastest pace since the 1980s. Now, we arrive at 2024, 2025, and especially 2026, when the refinancing wall hits. Trillions of dollars in corporate bonds must be rolled over. But instead of refinancing at 2 or 3%, companies are facing rates of 6, 7, or even 9%. Many companies were never built for that world. In 2008, households collapsed. In 2026, corporate balance sheets may be the first to snap. We could see a wave of bankruptcies, massive layoffs, and a collapse of so-called zombie companies that only survived because money was free. When you step back and look at history, you realize recessions rarely repeat the same pattern. The early 90s recession came from high interest rates and the S&L crisis. The 2001 recession came from the dot-com bubble bursting. 2008 came from subprime mortgages and derivatives. 3 downturns, 3 completely different causes. So why do we assume 2026 must look like 2008? Because 2008 traumatized our collective memory. It became the economic boogeyman. But the economy doesn't repeat its greatest hits. It mutates. If we want a historical parallel, we need to look elsewhere. Maybe the early 1990s, when high rates crushed both governments and corporations. Or the early 1980s, when inflation and interest rates combined to trigger a painful global recession. The 2026 recession will be driven not by financial engineering, but by the cost of money itself. Not by reckless consumers, but by strained governments. Not by Wall Street, but by the real economy. The global economy is walking into a trap it set for itself. Inflation forced central banks to raise rates, but governments and corporations can't afford those higher rates. Lowering rates too quickly risks reigniting inflation. So, central banks are stuck. They can't ease without consequences. In 2008, the Fed had unlimited freedom to cut interest rates. In 2026, it does not. That is the key difference. That is the trap. If the economy slows too much, policymakers will face a brutal choice: fight inflation or fight recession. They can't do both. Another crucial difference is where the pain will land. In 2008, the casualties were real estate, banking, and construction. In 2026, the likely casualties look very different. First, corporate debt-heavy sectors: telecom, retail giants, manufacturing firms with thin margins. They face a refinancing wall they may not survive. Second, government-dependent industries. If governments must cut spending, the shock will hit healthcare, public infrastructure, and education. And third, tech and speculative assets, because high interest rates crush the value of future earnings. This is why 2026 will feel so different. The pain will be uneven, unpredictable, and heavily dependent on government policy rather than banking weakness. Plus, 2008 was a global crisis, but it was triggered in the US this time. We may see multiple economies tipping into recession for different reasons, all at once. Europe, because of energy and debt, China, because of its real estate collapse, and emerging markets, because of a strong dollar. This isn't a synchronized crisis, it's a compounded one. This may be the most important difference of all. The recovery from 2008 was fast, because interest rates could be slashed to zero and stimulus could be unleashed without inflation fears. But in 2026, none of those lifelines exist. Rates can't be cut too fast. Governments can't borrow freely. Global supply chains are fragile. Inflation is still a threat. The recovery might look more like the slow grind after the early 1990s recession. When you strip away the numbers and the forecasts, what remains is something simple. The 2026 recession is not a financial crisis. It is a structural adjustment. The world built after 2008, built on cheap money, enormous stimulus, and globalized efficiencies, dissolving. And the world emerging to replace it is still undefined. This recession is not an accident. It's a transition from cheap capital to expensive capital, from unlimited debt to hard limits, from global integration to strategic fragmentation. And transitions are always painful. But they also reset the system. They force change. They create new winners. 2008 destroyed a broken housing system. 2026 will likely reset the role of debt, interest rates, and government responsibility. No one knows exactly how deep it will be, but one thing is clear: it will not look like 2008. Every recession tells a different story. Every crisis has a different cause. Every era breaks in its own way. And because of that, this next one will be unforgettable. Thanks for watching.